When we speak about Muhammad, of course, it is a controversial issue, not because there is any doubt about what the Islamic texts actually teach about Muhammad. That's quite clear. Anyone can get them and read them. But there is a great deal of misinformation and disinformation about Muhammad, just as there is about jihad and about the history of Islam and jihad, and a great deal of other related issues. So, for example, Karen Armstrong, who is a very prominent historian in the United States, in England rather, she wrote a book several years ago, actually 2 books about Muhammad, in which she said, among other things, that Muhammad is comparable to Gandhi in being a man of peace and in striving to bring peace to all those around him. She could only have said such a thing to an audience that didn't know anything about Muhammad as he is depicted in the Islamic text, because every bit of what ISIS, the Islamic State, does, or the Taliban, or the ISI in Pakistan, or any number of other organizations that are dedicated to following Muhammad and implementing his teachings, everything that they do is based upon Islamic texts. And ISIS is actually quite scrupulous in following the teachings of Muhammad, and the actions of Muhammad is exemplary in their actions, in what they do around the world, even the most horrifying things that they do. This is something that is denied or assumed to be false by most of the intelligence and law enforcement authorities in the world. As a matter of fact, you noted in introducing me very kindly that several of my books were used in FBI training materials. That was up until about 10 years ago. And then they dropped them because the Obama administration determined that they were going to not have any mention of Islam or jihad in connection with counter-terror training, because Islam has nothing to do with terrorism. Unfortunately, the terrorists would tell you different. And they would tell you that Islam has everything to do with terrorism, and that everything that they're doing is based on Islam. And when we look at the life of Muhammad as depicted in the Islamic texts, we can see that. Muhammad, according to the earliest available Islamic sources, was born in 570 in Arabia, in Mecca. And in the year 610, when he was 40 years old, he was praying in a cave on a mountain outside Mecca. And there appeared to him a being. In standard Islamic history, this is represented as the angel Gabriel. And according to Islamic sources, it was Gabriel, the angel, who appeared to Muhammad to give him the Quran over a period of 23 years subsequent to the first meeting. However, if you look at the earliest records, there is no mention of Gabriel, and the being is not identified. Muhammad is also depicted as being absolutely terrified by the vision that he had received, and not knowing if he was possessed by a demon, which is a strange response to having an encounter with an angel. He then went home shivering with fear and told his wife Khadija to cover him with a blanket because he was trembling. And he told her what had happened. Ultimately, she took him to her uncle, Waraka bin Nawfal, who was a Christian priest. And he explained to Muhammad, and all this, remember, is according to the earliest Islamic sources, that he was a prophet and that was Gabriel. However, there's a very strange aspect to the stories, and that is that Gabriel is terrifying. In their first encounter, it says that he pressed Muhammad so hard that he thought he was going to die. Now, ordinarily, when one encounters, in various religious traditions, when there are encounters with spiritual beings, when one is terrified and threatened and frightened, generally that being is not one that is bringing good. And this is the dilemma that is presented to us in the earliest Islamic texts. This is supposed to be the angel Gabriel, the messenger of Allah, the only God. And clearly, however, he's working on the basis of violence and intimidation. He's terrifying Muhammad into submission. And then later, there are other strange aspects of the story. Gabriel starts to visit him regularly, and then when he stops, Muhammad goes to the top of a high mountain, and he's going to throw himself off and commit suicide. This is also a strange reaction to what is supposed to be a benign heavenly being. In any case, Gabriel is thus identified, visits Muhammad on a regular basis for the next 23 years, and gives him what becomes the Quran, the holy book of Islam. And in the Quran, the holy book of Islam, we see the same violence and intimidation that Gabriel first displayed to Muhammad in the first encounter that they had. It's the same thing all the way through, that the Prophet Muhammad is supposed to submit and be the slave of Allah. And then the non-Muslims are supposed to submit and be the slaves of the Muslims. And all of the whole superstructure of Islam, women are supposed to submit and be the slaves to men. The whole thing is based on submission and intimidation and fear. Nowadays, of course, we see this in the Taliban very clearly. And the Taliban believe that they are carrying out the teachings of Muhammad and following the example of Muhammad. And so Muhammad said that Allah will pour molten lead into the ears of people who listen to music. And so they go and break musical instruments. This creates fear and intimidation among people who listen to music and the musicians themselves. And in microcosm, it is the same phenomenon all over again, that the people are terrified into submission. And that is the Islamic vision for the world. Very briefly, the career of Muhammad started out in Mecca with him preaching. Now, this is, again, a source of a great deal of, or the focus, I should say, of a great deal of misinformation and disinformation. Because Muhammad is preaching, he only gathers a small band of followers by the first 12 years of his career as a prophet, from 610 to 622. And he's preaching tolerance. In the Quran, in chapter 109, it says, "Say to the unbelievers, I do not worship what you worship, and you do not worship what I worship. You will not worship what I worship, and I will not worship what you worship. To you, your religion, and to me, mine." Now, that is rather grudgingly put, but it's nonetheless a statement of tolerance. Let's leave each other alone. We have different points of view. However, this was only something that Muhammad preached when the Muslims were a small band. When they grew larger, and later on, when Muhammad went from Mecca to Medina, another city in Arabia, he began to preach warfare against unbelievers. When the Muslims grew in number and gained power. Now, this is very important because in Islam, everything Muhammad did is exemplary. Chapter 33, verse 21 of the Quran says that Muhammad is an excellent example for you. An excellent example is not qualified. In other words, there is no limitation on that excellent example. Everything Muhammad did is good and to be imitated by the Muslim. Consequently, when the Muslims are a small band and Muhammad is preaching tolerance, when you have Muslims who are a small group in a particular nation, they will preach peace and tolerance. When they grow in numbers and power, then you will find they are preaching a very different message. Muhammad, in the year 622, was invited, according to Islamic tradition, by the people of Yathrib, which was a nearby city, which later on became renamed as Medina, or Medinat Nabi, the city of the Prophet. He was invited to come and be a political and military leader of the city, as well as the religious leader, and they would convert to Islam. Once there, he began to preach that Allah was giving him revelations about the necessity in the first place to fight defensive wars against the unbelievers, and then to fight offensive wars against the unbelievers, in order to bring them under the hegemony of Islam, to convert them to Islam, or if they refuse to convert to Islam, then to make them submit to the hegemony of Islamic law, and to recognize their degraded status in this world as well as in the next, as the punishment from Allah for refusing to accept Islam. The Quran is full of warnings that the unbelievers will be punished in this world and not just in hellfire. And the punishment in this world is to be enforced by the Muslims themselves, who will terrorize, strike terror in the hearts of the unbelievers. This is in chapter 8, verse 60 of the Quran, and bring them into submission to Islamic law, which guarantees them a second-class status. Now, this is something that Muslims have put into practice throughout history. In the first era of Islam, there were the caliphates. The caliphs were, caliph means successor. And the caliphs were the successors of Muhammad as the political, military, and spiritual leaders of the Islamic world. And just as Muhammad did, they led offensive wars against the neighboring states in order to bring them under the hegemony of the Islamic world. When the Arabs first came out of Arabia, after the death of Muhammad in 632, Islam was actually in an inchoate state and was not fully formulated dogmatically as it is today. However, those conquests in Islamic tradition have been ascribed to the imitation of Muhammad, who called for warfare against unbelievers, making the heart of the Islamic world, the Middle East, North Africa, and Persia, out of what had been Christian and Zoroastrian areas. And they were conquered. Then, according to the Quran, they were subjugated under the hegemony of the Muslims. The non-Muslims were made to submit. This is in direct, exemplary imitation of Muhammad, as commanding that Muslims must fight against the unbelievers. First, invite them to accept Islam. Then, if they refuse, ask them to pay the jizya, which is a tax specified in chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran, a tax in tribute to the Muslims as a sign of one's submission to their hegemony. And if they refuse both, to go to war against them. This is the paradigmatic basis for Islamic warfare that conquered a tremendous area of the world. By 732, 100 years after Muhammad died, there is a massive Islamic empire stretching from Spain into India. And of course, the jihad against India was particularly virulent because they were not, the Hindus in India were not considered people of the book. That is the Quran's designation for Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians. And they were therefore treated even more violently and not immediately given the option to submit, although that was later extended to them because the sheer numbers made it impossible for the Muslims to kill them all, although there were certainly attempts to do so. Now, all of this comes from Muhammad's life. The war and the conquest is what he pursued in Arabia, and then his followers, in imitation of him, brought it to the rest of the world. There are also other aspects of Muhammad as exemplary. For example, in Afghanistan in 2003 or 4, when the Taliban was toppled, supposedly, or toppled at least temporarily, the American aid workers went into refugee camps of the displaced people in Afghanistan, and they found that half the girls of second grade age were married, and all of the girls, third grade age and above, were married. And child marriage is a phenomenon all over the Islamic world. The Ayatollah Khomeini, the famous founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran, was 28 years old when he married his bride who was 10 years old. He also recommended that Muslim men marry girls before they reached puberty. In other words, when they're 9, 10 years old. Now, this also is an imitation of Muhammad as depicted in Islamic tradition. When Muhammad was 51 years old, he married a 6-year-old girl named Aisha, and consummated the marriage, or in other words, raped her, because of course she had no way to refuse consent, when he was 54 and she was 9. Because Muhammad is the excellent example as specified in Quran 33:21, as I noted before, that also is an excellent example. And there is considered to be no moral difficulty with seizing a child and raping the child, because Muhammad did it. Also, there is the sexual enslavement of non-Muslim women, or what we would say in the modern world, particularly in India, love jihad in various permutations, but its roots go back to Muhammad also. There is a famous story, for example, of the raid of Khaybar. Khaybar was an oasis in northern Arabia where the Jewish tribes that Muhammad had previously exiled from Medina had gone to take refuge. But Muhammad ultimately went and invaded Khaybar. And incidentally, it's worth noting that he arrived there at night, but waited to strike until the morning because he wanted to hear if there would be the Islamic call to prayer in the morning. If there was not, he would invade. If there was, he would not, because he was commanded, in his own words, according to a tradition, to fight against the people who, until they confess that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is the messenger. So if the people of Khaybar had confessed that there was no God but Allah and Muhammad was the messenger, he wouldn't have fought them. He did not hear the Islamic call to prayer, so he invaded. When he invaded, he wanted to get the money. So he went to the treasurer of the community. The Muslims captured him. His name was Kinana, and he had his followers build a fire on Kinana's chest to torture him until he revealed where the treasury was. Kinana refused to do so and was ultimately put to death. Then his wife, Safiya bint Huyai, was captured and given to Muhammad. Now, this is a woman who's not only her husband was killed, but her father was also just killed by the Islamic warriors in Khaybar. And yet Islamic tradition says that Muhammad married her, consummated the marriage on the spot. Can you imagine this absolutely ghastly scene of dead bodies everywhere, and Muhammad being so consumed with lust that he has to stop in the midst of these dead bodies and rape this woman. But this also is exemplary behavior, because Muhammad is the excellent example of conduct. Consequently, you have all over Europe, for example, nowadays, with the mass Muslim migration since 2015, a huge increase in the sexual assaults and rapes of non-Muslim women there. And you have this, of course, in India with the kidnapping, the abduction of Hindu girls, Sikh girls, Christian girls, and they're subjected to the same treatment. This is all because this is something that Muhammad did. And it's also specified in the Quran in chapter 4, verse 3, that you can marry up to 4 women, but also take the captives of the right hand. And the captives of the right hand are these infidel girls, specified in chapter 33, verse 50 of the Quran, to be the spoils of war. That is, seized in battle, just like Safiya bint Huyai, and used in this manner. All of these things come back to Muhammad. Many years ago, you don't hear it so much anymore, but many years ago, right after the United States got involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were many news accounts that actually had Muslim apologists claiming that beheading was completely against Islam, and it had nothing to do with Islam. But this was, once again, as is so often the case, based on counting on the ignorance of the audience, not to be able to understand that they were being deceived. In reality, beheading is specified in the Quran. When you meet the unbelievers, strike the necks. Chapter 47, verse 4. Consequently, the Muslims, according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad practiced beheading. He beheaded between 600 and 900 of the Jews of the Qurayza tribe that he claimed had betrayed him. And this was in accord with the Quran. Then in accord with the example of Muhammad and the Quran, you have beheading whenever there is a conflict between Muslims and non-Muslims. You see this all the time. As a matter of fact, just this morning, before beginning this program, I was reading a news article about the protests in Kazakhstan that you may have heard about. And 12 policemen were killed by the protesters. One of them was beheaded. And when you see a story like that, it is absolutely a direct result of the example of Muhammad. And of course, that's just one very small example of hundreds and thousands of such stories from all over the world that can be adduced in this connection. Muhammad also taught that anyone who leaves Islam is to be killed. Whoever changes his religion, kill him. As a result of that teaching, which is also continued and taught by all these schools and the schools of law and the various sects of Islam, they all still teach whoever changes his religion, kill him. Those who leave Islam are under an immediate death threat. And you can look at what has happened with Wasim Rizvi since he left Islam and all the inundation of death threats that he has received. This is because of Muhammad. Every bit of the activity that you can see from Muslims in the modern world today can be traced directly back to the example of Muhammad. Consequently, this is the primary responsibility of non-Muslim governing officials, law enforcement officials, and intelligence officials. If they want to deal with this problem adequately, they have to confront the fact that these values are what are being taught in mosques all over the world. Because Muhammad, as the excellent example, is still being taught everywhere. It's just as a matter of course. Every religion is going to teach what it teaches, and this is what Islam teaches. But there is tremendous, almost universal denial about this. And every non-Muslim politician in the West, from Merkel, who is no longer Chancellor of Germany, but I'm sure that her successor is just as bad, Macron in France, Boris Johnson in the UK, certainly Joe Biden, and all their predecessors, with the arguable exception of Trump, but not the complete exception of Trump. Every last one of them teaches, and the Pope as well, and every Western authority teaches that Islam is a religion of peace that has nothing to do with terrorism. I'm sure this is true also in India. Every non-Muslim state seems to be absolutely fanatically committed to the idea that Islam is peaceful. The first thing that we have to acknowledge is that that's not true. That Muhammad taught warfare, he engaged in warfare, and he left an example of warfare and subjugation for his people. And that if we do not confront this, if we're not realistic about this, it's just going to keep going on. One thing that could be done by non-Muslim states, if they had the courage, would be to say that Muslims are perfectly free to practice their religion in these various countries, but only insofar as they do not conflict with the law of the land. And so efforts to engage in violence against non-Muslims, to subjugate them, to impose Sharia, would be unacceptable and prosecuted fully. Were that to happen, along with prosecution of child marriage, polygamy, and so much else that comes from Muhammad's example, the world would be a very different place. I can give you one example in closing. There was a training camp discovered in the United States a few years ago in New Mexico, in a remote area. And the training camp was actually taking children and training them to be suicide bombers. And the idea was that they would go into schools and blow themselves up and kill large numbers of other children. This was being run by a man named Siraj ibn Wahhaj, who was the son of a very prominent Islamic spokesman in the United States, Siraj Wahhaj. And Siraj ibn Wahhaj had several wives. He had actually come to the attention of law enforcement previously for leaving one wife without divorcing her and marrying again. Polygamy is ostensibly illegal in the United States, but because the United States is primarily interested in not appearing to be Islamophobic, nothing was done about Siraj ibn Wahhaj's polygamy. And so he went to New Mexico and started this jihad training camp. If his polygamy had been prosecuted, as would be normal because it is illegal, then he wouldn't have been free to start the jihad training camp. If the United States and other states were consistent in applying their own laws to Muslims, which they are not doing because they're afraid, they're intimidated, and they want to accommodate them, then there would be a great deal less jihad activity around the world. But that is unfortunately just the opposite of what is happening. On that happy note, I will conclude, and if you have questions, we can discuss them now. Thank you.